Welcome to our discussion of Herodotus, the so-called father of history, so dubbed by Cicero. He, in fact, belongs to this great emergence of logos in the Greek-speaking world. We've seen with the philosophers that there was a spiritual breakthrough in Ionia, that part of the western coast of modern-day Turkey, where thinkers started to ask questions about the causes of things, the principles of things, without recourse to the gods as part of the account in some kind of propulsive manner. It was a way of trying to track natural causation. Certainly this inquiry was already going on with medicine, and in fact, Herodotus was born in Halicarnassus, which is across the strait from the island of Kos, where Hippocrates was doing his work. So I do think that that medical spirit was part of this. Halicarnassus and Kos are both right next to the region of Ionia where philosophy began. So the spirit, which in that discussion we had with Parmenides and Heraclitus, the fact that Miletus and other towns, city-states of Western Turkey were in a position to be at the center of many trade networks, that was part of that ferment, that intellectual ferment, that spiritual ferment that made possible this kind of breakthrough. The writing of history, or historiography, was an innovation, and it is plausibly attributed to Herodotus as the first practitioner of this discipline. That is, to conduct a systematic inquiry into the causes of events. To give more than what you find, or something different than what you find in mythology. So we've seen from the beginning with Gilgamesh that humans always try to make sense of the world, our experience, try to root it in origins. And so we have cosmogonies, we have the birth of the cosmos, we have theogonies, the birth of the gods. We have different ways of trying in mythology to give a story that will account for what we see now, ideological stories. Historiography has the same pathos to seek the origins, but it's doing it in a different way. Doing it in a way that would try to research the facts, as it were, as we've come as moderns to think of the facts. And that's a very beneficial kind of process. It's also a dangerous process, because then once you get out of the kind of mythological mindset where symbols and correspondences are part of one's imagination and the experience that one has, if one then seeks just the facts, ma'am, then there's a danger of losing the symphonic richness of experience. That said, it is a danger one must endure, because we do need to establish facts. And that's I think, one thing we need to keep in mind when I ask this question: does what has happened before us affect how I should act? What's the point of reading history, studying history? Does it matter what some person did 100 years ago, 50 years ago, 10 years ago, right? Where does it stop mattering? Why should another person's actions have bearing on my own actions, how I think about my actions, how I evaluate my actions, how I evaluate the possibilities of action? Does it make sense to read as an American about the American founding? Does it make sense to read about World War II or the Civil War? Does it make sense as an American to read about the birth of historiography in the Greek-speaking world in classical times? I think the answer is yes, of course, but that's something that we have to answer. This question we have to answer by thinking about what it is that history provides. Is it just a catalog of so-called facts? This is what happened. The difficulty is we do need to establish those things to have anything like historiography. What happened? On the other hand, is existence such that you can just say this thing happened and that be a sufficient way of accounting for an event? say. Because in fact, meaning suffuses any human events in ways that is not capturable by what we've come to call science. And history as a science must always remember that this is part of a picture, but an essential part. So I want to argue both things, that history is something that we must pursue. We must try to get to the facts, but recognize that establishing facts is always problematic, not because there aren't facts, but because facts are very, they're subtle, and they have an amplitude that cannot be simply condensed into a news report. So I want both things, both a serious engagement with history, but also recognition. We don't want to get rid of, say, the poetry. And that gets us to this point that Herodotus writes his great work, the histories, in prose. It is a novelty to do so. To write a prestige work in prose, what in the Greek-speaking world was a great innovation. It's something that was going alongside of the use of prose by philosophers. So we want to think about that. Not all philosophers wrote in prose. We know Parmenides wrote his poem, for instance. But for great thinkers to think great thoughts in prose as opposed to poetry is something that we're seeing more and more of in philosophers. And we see that really emerge with Herodotus and the histories. Why is that such a challenge to the traditional worldview? Well, think about Herodotus in relation to Homer, who is his primary template. I mean, that's the person he's inspired by and he's wrestling with. There's a rivalry, it's friendly, but it's also real. We see that in terms of the themes that are being brought forth. In the Iliad, we have the great battle between Greece in the heroic age, the Mycenaean age, and the Asians represented by Troy. The subject of the histories is, above all, the Greco-Persian wars, right? So you have Greece, once again, after the Dark Ages, built up to some mighty force and somewhat united in this cause, and opposing the Persians, right? The representatives of Asia. The Achaemenid Persian Empire was a true breakthrough in history. It was the first, probably one could say the first multi-civilizational empire, because it reached from out of the ancient Near East to include the Balkans all the way to the Indus. And it was structured by a post-mythological monotheistic religion, Zoroastrianism. So there were a lot of things that are very unique about the Persian Empire. When they defeated the Babylonians in 539, we have, of course, that's the conjunction with the biblical story and the return from exile of the people of the southern kingdom. All right, so that massive superpower, a power that had not been seen before in the history of the world, well, it had been resisted by the Ionian Greek city-states on the western coast of modern-day Turkey. And those city-states had called for backup from the Greek mainland. And for that insolence, the emperors of Persia were going to bring the whole Greek world to heel. So in 490, we have the great invasion by Darius, which was turned back at Marathon. And then we have, by Darius' son Xerxes, the second attempt in 480, the second invasion, which was stopped with several key battles. We have, of course, the famous stand, the 300, right, at Thermopylae. We have the decisive battle of Salamis, the naval battle of Salamis, led by the Athenian navy. And then we have the Battle of Plataea, which really laid the invasion to rest, and then kind of a follow-up, or a very important adjunct battle of Mycale. So these were the battles that ended the Second Persian invasion in 479. And from that point on, you have the great golden age of Athens starting to blossom. But also you have at the same time the conversion of this democratic power, Athens, which had proven itself, along with Sparta, right, to be the great military power of the Greek-speaking world, a power great enough to bring the world's superpower to its knees, that's the remarkable thing that one of the things Herodotus has to account for. While Herodotus is giving this account, while he's writing, say in the 430s and the 420s, Athens and Sparta were headed to their collision in the Peloponnesian War, which would begin in 431 and end in 404. That war is inextricable from the fact that this great democracy, Athens, which of course was already contradicted by the massive slavery that the democratic polity depended on, but even on top of that, there was the fact that Athens turned its League of Allies, which had been formed to resist further Persian aggression and to reverse some of the gains that Persia had made in the Greek world. Athens took this Delian League and made it into its own Athenian empire. So, as Thucydides would go on later to point out, right, this empire that you hold is a tyranny. Well, what does it mean for democratic polity to act the tyrant over other peoples? What does it mean for the celebration of liberty to take the liberty of others? Herodotus isn't taking this issue head on, but he's presenting these issues in the mirror of the Persian Wars. And that's the way this history is operating, I think. We saw with the Greek tragedians, what you have is the use of mythology to hold a mirror up to our personal experience. In this case, Herodotus is taking a recently concluded war, the Persian Wars, and I think holding it up as a mirror to the Peloponnesian War. That's a hypothesis anyway to try out. Again, what is happening here is a different kind of account of what's going on. It is using what one can say is logos, right? The desire to provide an account that could stand up to argument, to counter claims, an account that seeks the facts and seeks the truth as a matter of double-checking sources. We think that, well, it is believed by most that Herodotus had extensive experience of travel in the regions he's telling legends from and mythologies from, stories about they're far-flung from Scythia down to Egypt and into far eastern realms. He may have been a merchant. If he did all that travel, it would make sense that he was a merchant, but again, we don't have a lot of biographical detail. And what he was doing when he was doing all that traveling, part of it is that he clearly, I think it's safe to say, he wasn't at home in Halicarnassus. He was born under the Persian Empire. Persia had taken over that part of the world already. He was from a leading family, but maybe that family had fallen out of favor in Halicarnassus. In any case, he moved around. He ended up in Athens, maybe in 447, and spent a few years there. He became friends with Sophocles, so that's a nice conjunction with the last selection. And so he was roaming the world, and he was trying to make sense of what was going on by keeping all of these, even mythological stories, in mind in terms of current events. And so he sat down, and maybe in the 430s, he started to write this massive work, and doing it to give us something like a Homeric scale account, but do it in prose. And he's doing it in ways that clearly riff off of Homer, right? He's giving an account of a great war, as Homer does with the Trojan War, and as Herodotus does with the Persian Wars. But he's also including all this travel material. So that's the Odyssean kind of element in Herodotus. With the war, it is clear that Kleos, that concern for renown, which Homer is clearly about in the Iliad, we have in the beginning of the histories the statement, I, Herodotus of Halicarnassus, am here setting forth my history, that time may not draw the color from what man has brought into being, nor those great and wonderful deeds, manifested by both Greeks and barbarians, fail of their report, and together with all this, the reason why they fought one another. Fail of their report in this translation, akleia, so that the great deeds of both Greeks and barbarians not lose their kleos. Okay, so he's a different kind of celebrator of great deeds. And he's not just doing it for the Greeks. He's doing it, and in fact, Homer was not just doing it for the Greeks either, right? Homer was no more a jingoist, maybe even less in some ways than Herodotus. The point is celebrating the glorious deeds of men, but doing it against the universal backdrop, Greek and barbarian. That was part of what the histories, which is the word here, which is researches or inquiries. That's the word that Herodotus is using to describe his account, right? I'm giving my researches, and that's so that glorious deeds don't pass away, and so that I can give an account of what's happened here. This stunning reversal where the world superpower has been humbled by a band of fractious city-states. So that's the whole project. We often hear this framed in terms of the conflict of West and East. I've noted before, those terms really have to be put in scare quotes because the meanings shift, and they tend to shift westward as years go on, right? More helpfully, one can say, well, is it a battle, as Herodotus wants to say, a conflict, a struggle, a civilizational struggle between autocracy, which he identifies with Persia, and liberty, which he identifies with the Greek-speaking states? Well, that might be more helpful, except, again, when he's writing, already the imperialism of the Athenian city-state was already putting Athens on the path to self-destruction, even as Herodotus was writing. So I would suggest, yes, we are looking at the battle between the political, that is the life rooted in the polis, these different experiments in living, right? The Greek-speaking world, 1,000 polis, each with their own law codes and their own religious observances and so on. These were experiments in living. It was remarkable to have many of these joined together to resist an overwhelmingly regimented imperial state. There is liberty that is encouraged by having these different cities allowing different ways of being to flourish. So one might want to say the real battle isn't between East and West, whatever that might be. How Eastern is Troy compared to the Mycenaeans that they faced in that war. What we have, in fact, is political versus imperial. But then we have to remember that the imperial is a way of trying to realize that human desire for universality, right? The fact that we recognize we're all human, and there's something about us that wants to live in one community. And there's the fact that a polis can be just as imperialistic as a full-scale empire that isn't rooted in a city-state. So that's the question that I would say that we should bring to Herodotus, and I think that maybe he is in fact hinting at by showing us in this time of Athenian precarity what's involved in the dynamism of the Persian Wars, in fact. maybe recall Athens and his fellow citizens to I guess he wouldn't have been a citizen. What does it mean to be truly a supporter, a friend of liberty? What does it take? He would, in the end, leave Athens and live out his days in the Athenian Panhellenic colony of Thurii, which was in Magna Graeca, which is southern Italy. So he was always wandering. He was not someone who was trying to be a jingoist and just say the questions you can leave in abeyance because you have found your home. He was pursuing history as a way of keeping his thinking mobile, keeping his thinking alive, keeping the passion for truth alive. And that's what I suggest the study of history is necessary for, to always break down our false resolutions, the tendency we might have to say, this way of doing things is the only way of doing things, when in fact there are always new horizons to try to integrate or be integrated into. And that is what the great project of historiography is about when it's done well. We want to always do what Herodotus did, to be sensitive to the mythological background and all that imaginative richness, and balance that with a scientific concern for what is the case, and to live a rich life in between those two modes of living, where we are both poetic, but able to live in a world of prose, and to build a just kind of home in a world where there are great forces in contest with each other.